Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Hello, Richard, and good to be back on for Maritime Matters. Obviously, we skipped a week while you were gallivanting around the world. What have you been up to?
What have I been up to? Well, I've been doing a bit of my day job, so I've been doing some historianing, but I've also been quite happy. A few bits and pieces that I've been writing have come out. So I had a little piece out, a debate paper with Liz Buchanan talking about the AUKUS Optimal Pathway. That was out with the United States Study Centre. Talking about how optimal is the optimal pathway. So if you're interested in all matters AUKUS, check that out. And I also actually had something out with the Naval War College Review talking about uncrewed vessels and naval diplomacy. So again, if that's your bag, take a look. It's available with no paywall or anything like that. How about you? What have you been up to?
And we should say we're recording this on Friday, the 21st of June. If something incredibly exciting happens in the next 2 days in maritime that we don't discuss. This week I've been focusing a little bit on the Indian Ocean and the finishing touches of my beleaguered paper arguing why we need a Coastguard in Australia. And I had a piece out today talking about the fact that with women having been at sea for over 30 years and in the Navy for much longer, that it is time for a Deputy Chief of Navy that is female. So that's out. Check it out in the AFR and it will be available on my website. But Richard, what's been happening in maritime affairs for the last week, 2 weeks?
So I think that the really big news for this week is once again coming out of the South China Sea and out of the actions of the People's Republic of China. So the first kind of step in this was the new Coastguard order, which was announced, I think, at the sort of towards the end of last month, but the order entered force on the 15th of June. And this fits into a kind of a wider backstory that I suspect many of our listeners will know. In 2021, there was a Chinese Coastguard law, and this has raised a lot of sort of questions and heckles at the time, and people were really quite concerned about this because of the way in which this fit into a kind of a wider lawfare type approach. And in particular, it talks about the things that the Chinese Coast Guard can do within areas which are not, the language they use about the types of areas and the distinctions of different areas are not the same as those that are used in international law and things like UNCLOS. And so they talk about things like waters under Chinese jurisdiction. And nobody really knows what that means. There's no kind of definition. Now, this is something that's been on the back burner for a little bit in terms of people have been aware of this, but it's not actually yet. The rubber hadn't really hit the road, particularly in terms of this playing out. So this new Coast Guard order comes in, enters force on the 15th of June. And the really notable part of this is the degree to which it gives Coast Guard commanders, the right to detain foreign vessels who are sort of effectively misbehaving in these kind of waters under Chinese jurisdiction. And of course, what the Chinese consider to be waters under their jurisdiction, particularly in places like the South China Sea, can be waters that everyone else considers to be international waters or somebody else's EEZs, places where they have, as far as they see it, perfect international right under international law to be operating how they like. So that's kind of one half of this story. And the other half, which I think we'll perhaps come to in a second, is that this has been very rapidly then followed up by some extremely aggressive kind of action by the Chinese in response to another effort to resupply the Sierra Madre, the Philippine ship on Second Thomas Shoal. But before we go there, I thought you're the law person here, so I thought we'd tip over and you've had my kind of amateur's summary of this. What are your takes on this new Coast Guard order?
Mine are similar to yours. So look, Coast Guard Regulation number 3 that's come out, and it was actually announced in May, around the time that we know that in the Philippines, there are a number of civilian organisations who seek to do mass sales to some of the contested shoals. And so in May, there was an organisation, I forget the name of the group, who had decided that they were going to do a mass sale to Scarborough Shoal. And so this was the time that China publicly announced Coastguard Regulation number 3, which you mentioned about the ability to arrest and detain foreigners operating in waters China considers under their jurisdiction, detain them up to 60 days, which is quite significant, and also seize some of their equipment. As you point out, the regulation itself, many coastguards around the world would have some fairly similar regulations. But the distinct difference is that they would apply to their exclusive economic zones and to foreigners and foreign vessels that are breaching the coastal states' rights in their exclusive economic zone, so rights around resources. This is significant because the language in Regulation number 3, and in fact in the 2021 Coast Guard law that you mentioned, doesn't constrain China's Coast Guard to doing this in their exclusive economic zone. In fact, doesn't use those terms at all. It talks about waters under China's jurisdiction. And we know that China has said a number of times they consider the 9-dash line under their jurisdiction. So there's a real concern there that China's Coast Guard might seek to enforce these regulations within some of those contested zones. And I do actually wonder, and I know we're about to get to it, so might as well jump into it. I do wonder whether Monday's event actually was part of that enforcement. Hard to say, because when you watch the videos, all you can hear is people screaming at each other, understandably, quite a tense situation. But, we saw the incident on Monday of this week, 17th of June, where around Second Thomas Shoal, the Philippines attempted to resupply Second Thomas Shoal, and there was a number of Chinese Coast Guard vessels that attempted to stop them, and in the end actually boarded their vessel and seized some of their equipment, which sadly resulted in one of the Philippine sailors having their finger dismembered. Some pretty graphic footage. And I do actually wonder whether the timing is significant, as in the Coast Guard regulation comes into force on the 15th, and this kind of boarding, it's not actually entirely clear what's really happened, occurs 2 days later. So it could be a coincidence, but could actually be the Chinese Coast Guard thinking they are enacting that rule. What's your assessment of what happened at Second Thomas Shoal on Monday this week?
I mean, it's as you say, the videos are a little unclear at times, and trying to work out what's going on is challenging. But from what it looks like, certainly from my perspective, it is a further kind of ratcheting up of this, the degree of violence and force that is being used in a really kind of concerning way. So the previous sort of efforts to try and stop these kind of resupplies have largely initially involved kind of shouldering or kind of ramming type operations. And then there's been this use of water cannon, and there's been questions, I think quite rightly raised, about kind of what constitutes a use of force. I'm looking at some of the damage that's been done by water cannon in the previous incidents. And then this seems to now come on top of it. As far as we can tell from the videos, it does look like these are Chinese forces boarding Philippine vessels and acting in a very kind of hostile way, including being armed with a whole variety of sort of weird and wonderful things, including axes.
Yes.
And elements of it reminded me in some ways of some of the incidents on the Indian-Chinese border, where you see this kind of weird use of force, but within certain accepted kind of parameters. So I think that it does seem to be this sort of, again, this step up. And as you say, whether or not this has something directly to do with the Coast Guard order or not is very difficult to kind of work out.
So I agree, right? And I think, we've spoken a lot about the issues that have occurred around Second Thomas Shoal. And to be honest, every 2 weeks there's something new to talk about. But I think this is different. And I think that this should really be causing a step back, both in Australian strategic circles, certainly in US strategic circles and in Philippine strategic circles, to ask the question of where are we going with this? So pretty significantly, when we spoke about it, I think on our last episode, President Marcos gave the keynote address at Shangri-La, and in the questions he was asked that if there was a loss of life of a Filipino sailor, what would be the consequences? And he basically said that would be crossing the Rubicon. I'm paraphrasing, but that would be considered an armed attack. We're getting very close to this point. But I also think it needs to be viewed in terms of this is very clearly not about Second Thomas Shoal. And I think there was a great paper or a great article in War on the Rocks this week that I would commend to everyone from Zack and Greg Polling. We'll put it in the show notes, that talked about Vietnam's island building in the Spratly Islands and highlighted that China is overlooking very similar issues with other countries right now to focus in on the Philippines. And so I think that this is a bigger issue. This is really testing the web of relationships that the US, Australia, and other partners have sought to develop around the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that this week's events nearly need to be a cause for reconsideration of what is our strategy here and where do we think this is going. Because I think we're not too far away from seeing that Rubicon that President Marcos talked about crossed, and I'm not sure we have a clear strategy of what our response is. I think this incident shows that this is much bigger than just the Second Thomas Shoal conversation. What are your thoughts on that?
I was going to ask you a sort of a slightly more sort of directed question, which is about rules of engagement around this. Because when you're looking at things like, we're talking about potential for escalation, when you're looking at things like boarding of a vessel, you're beginning to get to some really difficult places in terms of rules of engagement for Philippine forces. And you're talking about Rubicons. At what point do we think that we might be seeing issues around the potential, of course, for the Philippines to be placed in a position where they have to decide whether or not they're going to be willing to use force to stop effectively the boarding of these kind of things? I mean, I'd be interested to say in your kind of operator's perspective on that, but it does feel like we are getting very close in a number of different ways to some really kind of difficult or sort of decisive points. That's my sense watching it. I had that kind of visceral feeling of this feels like we're getting towards the edge in certain things. So that was my kind of very personal sort of experience. But as I say, I'd be interested to know your thoughts in terms of REs.
No, I think it's a really good point. One of the things that hasn't really been talked about, so I'm glad you brought it up, is how restrained the Philippines have been. Given my experience operating with rules of engagement, Australia traditionally has quite constrained rules of engagement, but certainly under two scenarios. One, the scenario we saw on Monday with axes being wielded, lives being threatened of the Philippines military, and the scenario we saw a couple of weeks ago where we saw Chinese vessels within 5 meters of Sierra Madre, and the Philippines actually did pull their guns. To be honest, a commander in those circumstances, even with restrained ROE, would probably have normally met the criteria to meet the thresholds of hostile intent. Certainly the incident 2 weeks ago with the vessels in the vicinity of Sierra Madre. And then this week's incident, I mean, it's arguably the threshold of hostile act. And those are normally the two thresholds articulated in a country's rules of engagement about when a commander or an individual, depending on the circumstances, can make the decision to go further. So I think it should be remarked on how restrained the Philippines have been, and they clearly have very constrained ROE. But you're right. Like, I think that we are very close to the Philippines reacting to that. I mean, the commander of that small vessel, you've got Chinese Coast Guard vessels, there's a photo of them holding axes up above the heads of these sailors, very restrained from the command perspective.
It'll also be interesting to now see where the Americans go from here, because, as I say, it feels like if this is left and left to play out, then we've certainly not seen any sign that the Chinese are going to stop this sort of escalatory process. And so, yeah, it feels like we're reaching crunch time in a number of different ways.
I agree, and I've been surprised that we haven't seen more of a stern reaction. So we've seen the standard ambassadorial statements from Australia. We've also seen a statement come out of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on behalf of the government. But, realistically, I think the US would have to be thinking about, okay, do we start providing significant ISR coverage of these, which they have done before when things got tense last year, of these resupply missions to send a message. Of course, I've seen a lot of calls this week for the US and countries such as Australia to escort these vessels. My personal view is right now that would be significantly escalatory, and so not of my view. But I would have thought of some clever statecraft this week. I've been listening a lot to Alan Gingell's previous work, so I'm stealing the word statecraft this week around things like, if I was Australia, I would be considering announcing either gifting or assisting the Philippines in very quickly building a series of evolved Cape-class patrol vessels. And I would have made that statement, which would have sent a very clear signal to China what we think about the events this week. So there are other ways to send messages without getting up there with a naval vessel and escorting the ships, which I think would be a very bad move right now. But we haven't seen any of that. And, if this is really a testing approach by China on these series of relationships, and I really do think this is not about Second Thomas Shoal, and certainly I commend Zack Cooper and I think Greg Polling's piece in War on the Rocks talking about what's happening in the Spratlys, because it makes it very clear that the Philippines are being signalled out. That there does need to be a stronger response, a significantly stronger response, and I think we can think broadly about it. We saw the Philippines say last week that they wouldn't be sending a ship to RIMPAC, so the US exercise in the vicinity of Hawaii. Which happens every 2 years. Great run ashore, good shopping, but also a really good warfare exercise, having been many, many times. The Philippines announced they weren't sending a ship to RIMPAC, predominantly because of how busy they have been operationally, and they don't have a ship to spare. So I think, it would be a good response to kind of look at that capacity and make some announcements about that, which is clearly signalling to China. But on that, I think we've probably touched on this a fair bit, and we do need to move on. Red Sea, Richard. The Red Sea is also always bubbling away, but we have seen some developments, not ones that have been talked about too much, but what's happened in the Red Sea?
Yeah, so I was largely wanting to flag it in this episode, partly because there have been some quite significant developments, particularly last week, but more in some ways because of the fact that these things have been happening and so little has been sort of discussed about it, right? We've seen two very significant attacks on merchant vessels. On the 14th of June, the Houthis, so this is the attacks by the Houthi rebels based out of Yemen with the backing from Iran, and they've been conducting this sort of long-running campaign against shipping flowing sort of through the Red Sea, sort of between the Suez Canal and into the Indian Ocean. And so on the 14th of June, two missiles struck the MV Vibana, which was significantly damaged, and the crew was eventually forced to abandon ship. And I think the crew ended up being picked up by the USS Philippine Sea. So it's not unusual, bizarre, or sort of given the perspective perhaps of a few years ago, it's actually not that unusual for missiles to be hitting commercial vessels. A lot of the time, these things have actually not caused anything like as much damage as perhaps you would expect. Certainly, in some regards, it's kind of something of a surprise to me, quite how resilient a lot of these things like bulk carriers and other things are. But in this case, the missiles did cause significant damage, forced the crew to abandon ship. One of the things that was flagged quite strongly by the US CENTCOM, amongst others, was the fact that the Vibana issued a kind of a mayday, a call for assistance. The nearest ship was, in fact, an Iranian frigate, and the Iranian frigate chose not to respond. So this feeds into the wider sense. Obviously, we know that this is a group which is backed by the Iranians, but there are certain kind of things, and you'll know this far better than I will, that are expected in terms of events at sea, right? And this is very much again a sense of not fitting into what would be seen as kind of accepted conduct. And this is not just about us against them. This is something that mariners do for mariners around the world. So that was seen as something that was quite significant. A couple of days before, there was another attack on the MV Tudor. This was attacked with uncrewed surface vessels, and there's actually now a video out that I've seen on YouTube of this attack. It's no surprise that the ship was caused very significant damage. If you see the video, the explosions are very, very significant. The first one hit the engine room, the other one on the starboard side, I think. Again, the crew was forced to abandon ship. The Tudor has since sunk. And I think this is now the second merchant vessel that the Houthis have actually sunk in this campaign. The MV Ruby Mar, which was sunk by anti-ship ballistic missiles earlier in the year, I think was the first one. So significant activity going on there. I think this really matters. It matters for a number of reasons. One, I think, thing that was quite interesting about it is, and we were talking about this briefly before we went live, the fact that this was not a standard Houthi USV. This was a modified skiff. So for those of you who have kind of memories back to the campaigns that the Somali pirates ran in sort of off the Horn of Africa, it looks very similar to those kind of vessels. And the fact that they have successfully managed to modify this and deploy it with considerable success, to my mind, speaks again to how the kind of the democratization of this type of technology. This is not something that's super flashy. We're not thinking your kind of high-end sort of USV of the type that perhaps the American military are using. These are pretty basic kind of bits of kit, and yet they're proving incredibly effective. And I think one of the things that I think is really interesting about this campaign is particularly the USV element, is that these are not necessarily going to be hugely effective against warships, which are able to defend themselves, but against commercial vessels with very little by way of defense, they're proving very, very effective, and this is going to place significant pressures on navies. The other point, which I think is really worth highlighting, is that this campaign is still going on, right? It's kind of something that we've forgotten about. Nobody really talks about it, but it's still having an effect. They're still now sinking ships again. They're hitting ships, they're damaging ships, they're sinking ships. This is still impacting insurance rates. It's still forcing the majority of traffic out of the Red Sea and round the Cape, which is having wider impacts on shipping. And it's having impacts across a whole range of things, even down to the Egyptian economy, because they're getting less money through the Suez tolls.
Yep.
So lots and lots of impacts that are going on. We talk about this podcast as being Maritime Matters, right? This is something that's very much affecting the global economy. And yet, because it happens at sea, we kind of tend to ignore it. So I really wanted to kind of reinforce the fact that this is going on, no matter how much effort the navies are putting into protecting these ships. It's still proving really challenging. What are your takes?
I agree, and I do worry that it's becoming a little bit background noise in terms of people, certainly in Australia, are becoming immune to the conversation about it. I think this is a really significant thing that's happening over there for a number of reasons. One, as you say, it is highlighting how vulnerable ships are, especially merchant shipping in the littorals, right? And we kind of pick that up from the Red Sea, but this is kind of reinforcing it. Two, I think the use of that skiff as a USV is significant, because when you're operating in those waters and going through the Gulf and the Red Sea, there are skiffs everywhere. And as a merchant vessel, you expect that skiffs, or even as a warship, to be fair, are going to come fairly close to the ship, right? Now it's highlighting that these skiffs actually could pose a significant threat, and these skiffs might actually be the USV. So it does change the dynamic. I think the other problem is that it's not like the US or the UK, countries that had taken a keen interest in what the Houthis are doing, have stopped attacking them. In fact, there was a number of strikes about 2 weeks ago onto a number of Houthi assets. I think it was last week, the US took out a bunch of Houthi radar sites that they said were assisting with targeting. So they are trying to break the Houthis' capabilities to actually do this sort of stuff. So hitting their USVs, hitting their missile sites, hitting their targeting sites. But it's having limited effect. And actually what we're finding is the Houthis are becoming more deadly and more accurate. If you think about the majority of their attacks kind of November, December last year, early this year. It wasn't until February, I think, with the Ruby Mar that one of their attacks was actually successful in sinking the ship. And Ruby Mar sunk in early March, creating a huge pollution incident, by the way. So I think that this is actually a really important issue for a number of reasons, and as I mentioned, I think it's dangerous how immune we are becoming to the conversation about how this is impacting international shipping, international seafarers. There was a Philippine seafarer in the last week that has gone missing in the Red Sea, presumed dead. So it is really important. Now, in terms of other things, there's been a lot in the last 2 weeks, and we're not going to get to cover them all. But I think there is one that we do need to talk about, given that we are based in Australia. There was a significant Australian capability issue that has come up in the last 2 weeks. It's caused a lot of discussion. What is your take on the issues to do with the engineering of HMAS Supply and Stalwart, the Royal Australian Navy's replenishment ships?
Well, I think everyone has some pretty strong views on this one. I certainly do. So Supply, we know, has had issues for some time. And I think it was in Senate estimates that Mark Hammond flagged that these issues are ongoing. They're being resolved supposedly by Navantia under warranty. I'm not sure what kind of warranty you get with an AOR, whether or not it's like Mitsubishi and you get a 10-year sort of warranty. But anyway, they're being resolved. But this is a long-term process, and I think she might be out for up to 14 months, if off the top of my head.
Yes.
So
I think they said in estimates they weren't expecting to see her at sea this year.
Yeah, so significant impact, considering there were only 2 replenishment ships in the Australian Navy. So these are critical assets. And then obviously her sister ship, only very recently commissioned, HMAS Stalwart, has been called into Darwin for emergency repairs, again to the propulsion system, or sort of a wider propulsion system. And from the unofficial reporting that was coming out, these are emergency repairs to enable it to limp back to Darwin for further significant repairs. And again, from kind of unofficial reporting, a lot of this has to do with things like prop shafts, and the fact that a lot of what I would see as being pretty basic kind of engineering is causing real significant issues. And I talk quite a lot about naval construction, and I am deeply aware that this is a very, very challenging endeavour, and it is something that navies around the world and countries around the world find really hard. And so when you have issues in integration of high-end weapon systems on sort of first-of-class combatants, I'm willing to kind of cut people a bit of slack and actually say these things are hard and they're difficult. What we're talking about here is not particularly difficult, right? This is not rocket science. Having a straight propeller shaft is not something that's new, right? They've been doing this for 200 years nearly. Yes, okay, there have been slight changes. These vessels the engineering in these vessels is not sort of high-end challenging engineering in the same way that, for example, we've seen lots and lots of problems with the propulsion systems on the littoral combat ships in the United States because they've tried to do all sorts of very difficult things. This is not that. So it raises a whole host of kind of issues and questions about why these problems are happening, why they haven't been resolved, particularly questions around in terms of Stalwart. We know there have been issues with supply, and that's been flagged for a little while. Did we know that there were likely to be issues with Stalwart before, and we were kind of hoping that this would somehow not materialize? Who knows? But a lot of problems, I think, there. I think it also raises some real questions around Navantia. It's not exactly the first Navantia ship that's had propulsion issues. The LHDs have long had challenges there, and okay, that's a far more complex kind of propulsion system with the Atmos pods. But I think in terms of Navantia and particularly things like the General Purpose Frigate program, which they are one of the companies which is hoping to get the contract for the General Purpose Frigate, I think this is certainly not good publicity for them from that kind of perspective. that's my kind of grumpy complaint. What's your
Well,
views?
it's good. You've got to be spicy, right? Look, I guess I'm not as passionate about this issue, and maybe that's because in my history I was the XO of HMAS Success, covering up all the rust on that ship. Great fun. Wasn't. But I guess the way I look at this, my takeaways from this is actually that the lack of replenishment vessels in the Royal Australian Navy since World War II has always been an issue. So I take away from this, and at points we've had none, and at points we've had one, and now we have two. I always love the 3-to-1 rule that I know most engineers hate because it's more complicated in terms of availability. But for every 3 ships, you can expect to have 1 operational, right? We have 2 tankers. So this is the biggest thing I take away from this. We have 2 tankers. And so when you have 2 that have defects, that means you have no tankers, right? So I think this is an issue. And this is an issue that was an issue before the fleet review expansion announcement. It was more of an issue when we announced the fleet review expansion, and more of an issue when we cancelled the joint support ships, when Australia cancelled the joint support ships as part of the recent National Defence Strategy. That said, I do think when you're talking about issues with tankers, to be honest, if you want to solve this problem, so I understand from the reporting that, and certainly from estimates last week, that the issue is the long lead time for the parts to rectify this issue. The issue on supply. Stalwart, it's not clear what the issue is. It certainly hasn't been released publicly. Probably something similar. You can suspect it is a design issue or the way the vessels were constructed. And you've got to remember too, and I'm not saying this is excusable. I mean, drivetrains are common on all sorts of ships. It should be fairly simple to get sorted. It did occur during COVID. So these ships were built during COVID where there were issues with workforce. So I think you've got to remember that context. But I think the broader issue is the Royal Australian Navy should have more than 2 replenishment vessels. We certainly shouldn't have cancelled the Joint Support Ship project, or if that was to be cancelled, it certainly should have been replaced with another plan. But unlike warships, you can very quickly solve this by either converting a merchant ship or getting these made quickly. So in terms of the capability holes that the Australian Defence Force has and the Royal Australian Navy has, this is one that could be rectified quickly. If the choice, and for not a lot of money compared to the, I think the price of a Hunter per hull, and I'm not going to get this right, but is indicative about 4.5 billion per hull, right? You can get a tanker converted or built very quickly at a lot less. So yes, it's not excusable that there are these defects. I do also subscribe to the rule that new ships always have teething issues. I think this is pretty standard, and these ships also operate in some pretty robust environment. So again, I'm not defending the issue, but I'm not as passionate about it as others because ships have defects. But I think the broader issue is the structure of the fleet and what this has revealed in terms of how that structure is a bit off. That would be my comments on it, but it has caused a bit of a ruckus. Any other points you had for this week?
So the only other thing I wanted to kind of flag in terms of capability was the formal announcement of this sort of new company that's being formed, a joint venture by Huntington Ingalls Industries of the United States and Babcock from the UK. So they're forming a new company, H&B Defence. Both companies, obviously, so Huntington Ingalls Industries are one of the 2 manufacturers of American submarines. Babcock have the contract for maintenance on UK submarines, so they do a lot of the maintenance work. This is clearly transparently and explicitly a move to sort of build up submarine capability in sort of workforce and industrial capability in Australia, drawing on 2 of the big kind of AUKUS related prime sort of defence companies. So it's not surprising. There have been lots of discussions about sort of Babcock and Huntington for some time, and obviously these type of things were going to happen. What I think is quite interesting is we're beginning to move beyond. So far, most of the AUKUS announcements and sort of discussion has been on a kind of government kind of level, talking about what the government's going to be doing, and then thinking about kind of navies and transfers of personnel and training and that side of things. We're now beginning to see the commercial and industrial connections forming, which will enable a lot of this to happen. So I think in that regard, it can be seen as part of the narrative that AUKUS is progressing, and it's progressing exactly as you would kind of anticipate. Now, the fact that you formed a new company doesn't solve your workforce problems or any of the other issues that are there, but I think this fits broadly into the narrative that we've talked about a couple of weeks ago. AUKUS, for all of the noise, if you look underneath, you can say that a lot of things in AUKUS are kind of progressing exactly as you would anticipate. And I think this is one part of it. So not a particularly big story, but I think it's worth, on something like this, worth flagging.
It certainly is. And one other thing we should mention on capability before we move on and wrap up is today is, I would say, Happy Hunter Class Day. Today is actually a significant day, the milestone of the Hunter class frigate. So the project that we have talked about substantially, very expensive project to deliver 9, now 6 Hunter class frigates. Today, in fact, I understand there is about to be a big announcement in South Australia. Everyone seems very excited about it. It's the day we move from the design to actually starting to build the first of the Hunter class frigates. So that's pretty cool. I think I saw in the estimates last week, it might have been the Chief of Navy or potentially someone from NSSG said that we expect to see the first Hunter class in the water in 32 and commissioned in 34. So we've started to build the ship that we will commission in 10 years from today. But it is a good milestone as we start to see the renewal of the Royal Australian Navy's fleet. So we had to mention that. Happy Hunter Class Day.
That is a good day.
It is. And I think we might wrap up. We don't have a Did You Know today because we do have a special announcement. We are going to come to you with a bit of a special edition of Maritime Matters. The thing we haven't mentioned that was announced in the last 2 weeks that was quite significant was Admiral Paparo from Indo-PACOM talking about the concept of the hellscape in the Taiwan Strait. So we are going to come to you with a special edition with some special guests that break down what is the hellscape, what might that look like, how might that be effective, and break that down a little bit.
Excellent. Going to look forward to it.
Well, you'll be participating in it. But thanks so much, Richard. Have a great weekend.
You too, Jen.
Thanks, Richard.